Thatcher Elliott Wells knew three things about hiring help. They always wanted more money, they always left eventually, and they always lied about something. Standing in his expansive Vermont kitchen, gray-green eyes scanning the fourth resume this month, he felt that familiar knot of irritation tighten in his chest. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric shadows across the marble countertops. Everything in his minimalist mansion designed for order, control, peace. Everything except the chaos that had become his life since Marlowe stopped speaking. Elodie Catherine Quinn, he read aloud, his voice echoing in the silence. 27 years old. Previous childcare experience at a small daycare in Burlington. References available upon request. The paper felt thin between his fingers, almost fragile, like everything else that had touched his world lately. From upstairs came the soft sound of crayons against paper. Marlowe drawing again, always drawing. Houses with crooked chimneys, trees with too many branches, animals that looked more like wishful thinking than reality. His daughter's silence had become another piece of furniture in this house, present, unmovable, and growing heavier each day. The doorbell chimed, its modern tone cutting through his thoughts. Thatcher straightened his navy wool sweater, ran a hand through his dark hair, and walked to the front door with the measured steps of a man who had learned to control every variable he could. She stood on his doorstep like something out of a different decade. Elodie Quinn had the kind of face that belonged in old photographs. Soft, genuine, unmarked by the sharp ambition he'd grown accustomed to seeing in job applicants. Her light brown hair fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, and she wore a cream-colored cardigan over dark jeans, carrying a worn leather bag that had clearly seen better years. "Mr. Wells?" Her voice was quieter than he'd expected, with a slight raspiness that suggested either nerves or too much coffee. "I'm here about the position." Thatcher's trained eye took inventory. No expensive jewelry, practical shoes, fingernails clean but unpolished. Either she was genuinely modest, or she was very good at playing the part. 2 years of disappointments had taught him to assume the latter. "Come in." He stepped aside, watching as she took in the space. Most people gasped at the soaring ceilings, the architect-designed staircase, the carefully curated modern art. Elodie simply nodded as if she were acknowledging a friend rather than being impressed by wealth. "It's peaceful," she said, and something in her tone made him pause. Not beautiful or amazing, peaceful, as if she understood that peace was what this house was built for, even if it had failed to deliver. They settled in his study, across from each other at the mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. Thatcher pulled out a legal pad, his pen poised to take notes that would later become reasons to say no. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Quinn." Elodie folded her hands in her lap, a gesture so simple it seemed studied. "I've worked with children for the past 3 years. Before that, I spent some time finding my direction." A pause. "I understand your daughter has been through a difficult period. That's putting it mildly." The words came out sharper than intended. Thatcher caught himself, softened his tone. "Marlowe hasn't spoken since the accident. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong, but sometimes silence is the safest place," Elodie said quietly. Something about the way she said it, not like a rehearsed interview answer, Jan, but like a truth she'd lived, made Thatcher look up from his notes. Her green eyes held a depth that didn't match her simple resume, and for a moment, he found himself curious rather than suspicious. Then his training kicked back in. Beautiful woman, tragic circumstance, perfect words. He'd seen this movie before. "What makes you think you can help her when 3 previous babysitters couldn't?" Elodie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window where Vermont's autumn colors painted the glass. "I don't know if I can help her speak again, Mr. Wells, but I know how to sit with silence without trying to fill it." Upstairs, as if summoned by their conversation, came the sound of Marlowe's bedroom door closing. Thatcher's jaw tightened. His daughter had a sixth sense about strangers in the house, usually retreating further into her shell whenever someone new arrived. But today, instead of the usual thud of objects being thrown or the muffled sounds of distress, there was only quiet, and somehow, that felt more dangerous than any tantrum. The first thing that bothered Thatcher about Elodie Quinn was how naturally she moved through his house. It had been 3 days since he'd hired her, against his better judgment, and she navigated the minimalist spaces like water finding its level. No stumbling over the low-profile furniture that caught most visitors off guard. No hesitation at the hidden cabinet handles. No obvious gawking at the commissioned sculptures that cost more than most people's cars. From his home office, Thatcher found himself listening for sounds that never came. No raised voice trying to coax Marlowe into conversation. No frustrated sighs when his daughter retreated to her room. No television turned up too loud to fill the uncomfortable quiet. Instead, there were new sounds, soft humming that drifted down the hallway, melodies he almost recognized but couldn't quite place, the gentle clink of dishes being arranged, not just cleaned, and something that made him stop typing mid-sentence. His daughter's footsteps, lighter somehow, moving toward sounds instead of away from them. Thatcher saved his architectural plans and walked quietly toward the kitchen, his sock-covered feet silent on the hardwood floors. What he saw made him freeze in the doorway. Marlowe sat at the breakfast bar, her small legs swinging from the high stool, watching Elodie arrange a plate of cut apple slices into the shape of a flower. His daughter's blonde hair hung loose around her shoulders, not the tight braids she usually demanded, which made her look like she was bracing for battle. The poet Emily Dickinson wrote about apples once, Elodie was saying, her voice conversational despite the lack of response. She said hope is the thing with feathers, but I think sometimes hope is the thing with seeds, planted in the ground, waiting for the right season to grow. She placed the apple flower in front of Marlowe, who tilted her head to study it, not eating, just looking, as if the arrangement contained a message she was trying to decode. Your daddy tells me you like to draw, Elodie continued, wiping her hands on a cream-colored dish towel. I used to draw when I was your age. Mostly sad things, though. Happy things seem too hard to get right. Marlowe's blue eyes flicked up, meeting Elodie's for just a second before dropping back to the apples. But it was a look, the first real eye contact Thatcher had seen his daughter make with a stranger in 2 years. Something cold shifted in his chest. Relief, maybe, or fear. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. Elodie moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the maples that lined his property. I wonder what you see when you look outside. I bet it's different from what grown-ups see. We forget how to notice things after a while. She was right. When was the last time he'd actually looked at those trees, rather than just noting they needed pruning? When had he stopped seeing beauty and started seeing maintenance? Mr. Wells. Elodie's voice startled him from his thoughts. She was looking directly at him. No embarrassment at being caught talking to a child who didn't talk back. I was wondering if Marlowe might like to help me make lunch. Nothing complicated. Just sandwiches. Marlowe turned to look at him too, and the expression on her face was so tentative, so hopeful, that it physically hurt to witness. How long had it been since she'd looked at him like that, as if he might say yes to something that mattered to her? She doesn't usually, he started, then caught himself. Doesn't usually what? Participate, show interest, trust people enough to want to be near them? That's okay, Elodie said gently. We can just see what happens. And there it was again. That phrase that somehow contained more wisdom than it should. We can just see what happens. When had he forgotten that life could work that way? That not everything needed to be controlled, predicted, protected against? Marlowe slid down from the stool and walked to Elodie's side, standing close enough that her small shoulder brushed against the woman's hip. Not touching, exactly, but closer than she'd stood to anyone in months. Thatcher felt that familiar surge of protectiveness rise in his throat. This was happening too fast. Marlowe was too fragile, too hurt, too precious to risk on a stranger with a thin resume and eyes that held secrets. What did they really know about Elodie Quinn? What was she hiding behind that gentle voice and those carefully chosen words? But as he watched his daughter reach for a piece of bread, her movements more animated than he'd seen them in 2 years, Thatcher realized something that made his chest tighten with panic. For the first time since the accident, Marlowe looked like she wanted to be alive again, and he had no idea whether that was the most wonderful thing in the world, or the most dangerous. The decision came to Thatcher at 2:47 a.m., when sleep eluded him for the 4th night in a row. He stood in his bedroom window, looking down at the guest cottage where Elodie stayed, a converted carriage house he'd barely thought about until now. A single light glowed in the upstairs window, casting a warm rectangle across the frost-covered grass. What was she doing awake at this hour? Reading, writing, making phone calls to people she'd conveniently forgotten to mention. The questions had been multiplying like weeds since she'd arrived. How did someone with basic childcare experience quote Tennyson while making breakfast? Why did she arrange silverware by size, always the same pattern, like a ritual he didn't understand? And what was it about the way she looked at Marlowe? Not with pity or professional distance, but with recognition, as if she saw something in his daughter that others missed. Thatcher pulled on dark jeans and a gray sweater, moving quietly through his house toward the office that doubled as his security center. When he'd had the mansion built, the contractor had insisted on a comprehensive system: motion sensors, entry alerts, cameras in every common area. At the time, it had seemed like reasonable caution for a man with wealth and a small child. Now, it felt like necessity. The monitors flickered to life with cool blue light, displaying angles of his home he rarely saw. The kitchen island where Marlowe had eaten her first full meal in weeks. The living room where Elodie had sat cross-legged on the floor reading picture books to an audience of one silent listener. The hallway outside his daughter's bedroom where most babysitters had eventually given up and retreated. Thatcher pulled up the footage from earlier that evening. 7:30 p.m. Elodie helping Marlowe into pajamas, both of them moving with an ease that had taken his last 3 babysitters weeks to achieve. His daughter's face, usually guarded and tense, looked almost peaceful. 8:15 p.m. Bedtime story. But instead of the simple children's books most people chose, Elodie sat in the rocking chair reading from a worn copy of poetry. Her voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the verses, and Marlowe's eyes stayed open longer than they had in months, watching the woman's face as if memorizing something important. "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too?" Elodie's recorded voice drifted from the speakers. Emily Dickinson again. Why always the sad poets? Why did his daughter seem to understand every word despite her silence? Thatcher fast-forwarded through the evening routine, looking for, what? Evidence of theft? Suspicious phone calls? Someone taking photos of his home's layout? Instead, he found Elodie moving through the house like she belonged there, straightening cushions that didn't need straightening, watering plants with the kind of attention that suggested genuine care rather than obligation. At 10:30 p.m., she stood in the kitchen washing dishes by hand, despite the perfectly functional dishwasher. Her movements were methodical, almost meditative, and twice she paused to look out the window toward the main house, checking on them, maybe, or planning something. But it was what happened next that made Thatcher lean forward, his breath catching in his throat. Elodie finished the dishes, turned off the kitchen lights, and walked upstairs toward the guest bedroom. The camera angle caught her in profile as she passed through the hallway, and in that unguarded moment, her composed expression crumbled completely. She stopped walking, pressed her back against the wall, and began to cry. Not the delicate tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the raw, silent sobbing of someone who thought she was alone. Her shoulders shook as she slid down the wall to sit on the floor, her face buried in her hands, her careful composure dissolving into something that looked like grief so deep it had no bottom. Thatcher found himself reaching toward the screen, an instinctive gesture that stopped him cold. When was the last time he'd wanted to comfort someone? When had he stopped seeing other people's pain as a threat to his own carefully constructed defenses? The woman on the screen was not the serene, slightly mysterious caregiver who had charmed his daughter and unsettled his routine. This was someone broken, fighting battles he couldn't see, carrying weight that bent her shoulders even in solitude. After several minutes, Elodie wiped her eyes, stood up, and walked to her bedroom with steady steps. The transformation was complete, as if she could put on competence like a coat, wear serenity like a mask. Thatcher sat back in his chair, staring at the now empty hallway on the monitor. Everything he thought he knew about Elodie Quinn had just shifted, and he wasn't sure if that made her more trustworthy or more dangerous. One thing was certain: she was hiding something big enough to cry about when she thought no one was watching. The question was whether it was something that could hurt his daughter, or something that might finally help them all heal. The sound hit Thatcher like a physical blow. Laughter. Not just any laughter, Marlowe's laughter, bright and genuine, floating up from the kitchen on a Thursday morning that had started like any other. He froze at the top of the stairs, his coffee mug suspended halfway to his lips, afraid that moving might break whatever spell had been cast in his own home. It had been exactly 1 week since he'd watched Elodie cry in the hallway, and every day since had brought small changes that left him feeling like a stranger in his own life. Marlowe ate breakfast without being coaxed. She followed Elodie around the house like a curious shadow. She'd even started leaving her bedroom door open, a tiny revolution that somehow felt monumental. But laughter. When was the last time his daughter had laughed? Thatcher descended the stairs quietly, his architect's training making him unconsciously aware of which steps creaked. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Elodie standing at the counter, her back to him, while Marlo perched on her usual stool. Between them sat what appeared to be a disaster zone of flour, eggs, and mixing bowls. "Okay, your turn," Elodie was saying, holding out a whisk. "But remember, pancake batter likes to be mixed gently. If you're too rough with it, it gets tough and angry." Marlo took the whisk with both hands, her concentration absolute. She stirred with the careful precision of someone performing surgery, and when a small puff of flour escaped the bowl, she looked up at Elodie with wide eyes. "It's escaping!" Elodie gasped in mock horror. "Quick, we have to catch it before it takes over the whole kitchen." And that's when it happened again. That bright, bubbling sound that transformed his daughter's face into something he'd almost forgotten she could be. Happy. Simply, purely happy. Thatcher found himself smiling before he realized it, the expression feeling foreign on his face. When had he stopped smiling? When had joy become something that happened to other people, in other houses, in other lives? "Mr. Wells." Elodie turned, noticing him in the doorway. Her cheeks were dusted with flour, and there was batter on her green sweater, but she looked more alive than anyone had a right to look while making breakfast. "We're conducting a very serious pancake experiment. Marlo is the head scientist." His daughter turned to look at him, and for a moment, just a moment, her eyes held no shadows. She looked like the little girl who used to wake him up on Saturday mornings, demanding elaborate pancake shapes and extra syrup. "Scientist, huh?" Thatcher set down his coffee and walked closer, noting how Marlo didn't retreat or tense up at his approach. "What's the hypothesis?" "That happiness is a necessary ingredient," Elodie said simply. "We're testing to see if sad pancakes taste different from happy ones." It was such a ridiculous statement that Thatcher almost laughed himself. Instead, he found himself asking, "And what's the preliminary data showing?" Marlo pointed to 2 plates on the counter. One held a perfectly round golden pancake. The other held something that looked like it had been made by someone having an emotional breakdown. Lopsided, slightly burnt, with edges that suggested the cook had been distracted by tears. "The sad one was my practice round," Elodie explained, her tone matter of fact. "I made it yesterday when I was thinking about things that hurt. The happy one is Marlo's, made this morning while we were talking about what we wanted to dream about tonight." Thatcher stared at the 2 pancakes, struck by the simple honesty of the comparison. When was the last time he'd let himself feel anything fully enough to affect something as basic as cooking? When had he become so controlled that even his food had no emotional fingerprints? "Can I try them?" he heard himself ask. Elodie cut small pieces from each pancake, arranging them on a plate with the kind of care that suggested this was a genuine experiment, not just whimsy for a child's benefit. Thatcher took a bite of the sad pancake first. It was technically perfect, but somehow flat, lifeless. The happy pancake, despite being slightly uneven, had a lightness that seemed to dissolve on his tongue. "The results are conclusive," he said solemnly, looking directly at Marlo. "Happy pancakes are scientifically superior." His daughter nodded gravely, as if he'd confirmed something she'd suspected all along. Then she picked up her fork and took a bite of her own creation, and the small smile that crossed her face was worth more than every architectural award he'd ever won. "Marlo wants to make you one," Elodie said softly. "A happy pancake, just for you. Would that be okay?" Thatcher looked at his daughter, who was already reaching for the mixing bowl with determined hands. For the first time in 2 years, someone was asking to make something specifically for him, not because they had to, not because it was their job, but because they wanted to. "I'd be honored," he said, and meant it. As Marlo began stirring with intense concentration, Thatcher caught Elodie's eye. She was watching his daughter with an expression that looked like hope mixed with something deeper. Protective love, maybe, or the careful tenderness of someone who understood how fragile good moments could be. And for the first time since he'd installed those cameras, Thatcher realized he wasn't watching Elodie Quinn anymore. He was learning to see her. The revelation came during the most ordinary moment imaginable. Thatcher was reviewing blueprints in his study when he heard Elodie's voice drifting from the living room. Not the gentle storytelling tone she used with Marlo, but something raw and unguarded. Through the partially open door, he could see her sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his daughter, who was arranging colored pencils in precise rows. "I had a little girl once," Elodie was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. Not mine, but I was supposed to take care of her. Her name was Penny, and she had red hair that curled at the ends, and she laughed at everything, even things that weren't funny. Thatcher's hands stilled on the papers. Marlo had stopped organizing her pencils and was watching Elodie with the intensity she usually reserved for injured birds. Penny lived in the same place I did when I was 16, a group home, where kids went when their families couldn't. When things got complicated, Elodie picked up a blue pencil, turning it over in her fingers. I wasn't supposed to be watching her that day, but the grown-ups were busy, and Penny wanted to play outside, and I thought 15 minutes wouldn't matter. The silence that followed was so complete that Thatcher could hear his own heartbeat. Marlo reached out and touched Elodie's hand, the first time he'd seen his daughter initiate physical contact with anyone since the accident. She ran into the street chasing a butterfly. Elodie continued, her voice breaking slightly. She was only 4. The driver couldn't stop in time, and I couldn't reach her fast enough. I was right there, and I couldn't save her. Thatcher felt something cold settle in his chest. The cameras had captured Elodie's tears, but not this. Not the source of a pain so deep it had shaped everything about the woman his daughter had learned to trust. That's why you understand? Marlo's voice was so quiet it was barely audible, but it cut through the room like a bell. Both adults froze. Thatcher's blueprint scattered to the floor as he stood up, moving toward the living room on unsteady legs. His daughter had spoken. After 2 years of silence, Marlo had found words for the exact moment when someone else's grief touched her own. Elodie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look surprised. She nodded as if she'd been waiting for this moment, as if she'd known that recognition would eventually build a bridge between two kinds of loss. Yes, Elodie whispered. I understand what it feels like when the person you love goes away and you think it's your fault. Marlo's voice came stronger this time, though still fragile as spun glass. Mommy went away because I unbuckled my seatbelt. She turned around to fix it, and then the other car. Oh, sweetheart. Elodie pulled Marlo into her arms, and Thatcher watched his daughter melt into the embrace, the first real comfort she'd accepted since the funeral. It wasn't your fault. Bad things happen, and we can't always stop them, but that doesn't make them our fault. Thatcher gripped the doorframe, his knees threatening to give out. For 2 years, he'd tried everything: therapy, specialists, patience, pressure, bribes, tears, to get Marlo to talk about the accident. And here was Elodie, carrying her own impossible guilt, creating a space where his daughter finally felt safe enough to speak her deepest fear. I stopped talking because Marlo's voice muffled against Elodie's shoulder. Because if I don't say anything else, I can't say anything that makes people go away again. The logic was heartbreaking and perfect. Thatcher had to press his fist against his mouth to keep from making a sound that would shatter this moment. His brilliant, wounded little girl had constructed an entire philosophy of silence to protect the people she loved from her words. But staying quiet doesn't keep people safe, Elodie said gently, stroking Marlo's hair, and it doesn't keep them close either. Sometimes the only way to hold on to love is to let it hear your voice. Thatcher realized he was crying, silent tears that burned his cheeks and freed something that had been locked in his chest for 2 years. His wife's death hadn't been Marlo's fault, but it hadn't been his either. Somehow, watching his daughter accept forgiveness made it possible for him to imagine forgiving himself. But beneath the relief and gratitude, a new fear was growing. Elodie hadn't just helped his daughter find her voice. She'd trusted them with the deepest wound of her own life. This wasn't the careful professional distance of a babysitter anymore. This was love, real and transformative and dangerous, because people who loved this deeply were also capable of leaving. And now that Marlo was talking again, speaking Elodie's name with something approaching worship, what would happen if the woman who had given them back their voices decided to use hers to say goodbye? From the living room came the sound of quiet conversation, his daughter asking questions, Elodie answering with gentle honesty, 2 wounded souls finding healing in shared understanding. And Thatcher stood in the doorway, afraid to enter and afraid to leave, finally understanding that love wasn't something you could install cameras to monitor. It was something that happened when you stopped watching and started trusting. The morning after Marlo found her voice, everything and nothing had changed. Thatcher woke before dawn, as he had every day for 2 years. But instead of the familiar weight of dread pressing against his chest, he felt something else entirely, a lightness that was almost frightening in its unfamiliarity. His daughter was talking. The silence that had become their language was broken, and the house felt different, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath for too long. But with relief came vulnerability. Now that Marlo was speaking, how long before she no longer needed the woman who had taught her it was safe to use her voice again? From his bedroom window, Thatcher could see the guest cottage. No light in the upstairs window this time. Elodie was either sleeping peacefully or had learned to cry in the dark. The thought bothered him more than it should have. When had her well-being become something that kept him awake at night? Downstairs, he found them in the kitchen again, but this morning was different. Marlo sat at the breakfast bar chattering, about a dream she'd had involving flying horses and libraries made of clouds, while Elodie listened with the kind of attention that made every word seem important. "And then the horse told me that books taste like cotton candy if you're dreaming," Marlo was saying, her small hands gesturing excitedly. "But only the good books. The sad ones taste like vegetables." "That makes perfect sense," Elodie replied seriously, as if dream logic was the most rational thing in the world. "I always suspected that stories had flavors." Thatcher stood in the doorway, afraid to interrupt what felt like a miracle. His daughter's voice, animated and bright, filled spaces in his heart he hadn't realized were empty. But it was the way Elodie looked at Marlo, with genuine delight rather than professional patience, that made something shift dangerously in his chest. "Daddy!" Marlo spotted him and bounced in her seat. "Elodie says we can make French toast today, and I can crack the eggs by myself because I'm an excellent egg cracker now." "The evidence is compelling," Thatcher said, walking into the room and feeling, for the first time in months, like he belonged in his own kitchen. "I'd like to witness this excellent egg cracking firsthand." As Marlo carefully maneuvered an egg against the bowl's edge, Thatcher found himself standing closer to Elodie than strictly necessary. She smelled like vanilla and something else. Something clean and warm that reminded him of Saturday mornings and a life he'd almost forgotten he'd wanted. "She talked for almost an hour after you went upstairs last night," Elodie said quietly. Her voice meant only for him. "About you, mostly. How you read to her when she was little. How you used to build pillow forts that were architecturally sound." The phrase hit him like a physical blow. He'd forgotten that Marlo remembered those Sunday afternoon construction projects, when he'd used his professional skills to create the most elaborate blanket fortresses Vermont had ever seen. "She missed your voice too," Elodie continued. "Not just finding her own, hearing yours. She said you used to sing while you worked, and the house felt full of music." Thatcher's throat tightened. He had sung before, hummed while drafting plans, whistled while cooking breakfast, filled the spaces between words with melodies that made their home feel alive. When had he stopped? When had silence become his default setting? "Look, Daddy!" Marlo held up a perfectly cracked egg, beaming with pride. "No shells." "Excellent technique," he said, his voice rougher than intended, very professional. As they cooked together, an actual conversation flowing between all three of them, Thatcher became aware of how naturally Elodie fit into the rhythm of his family. She anticipated Marlo's needs without hovering, included him in decisions without deferring, and created space for both of them to be better versions of themselves. This was dangerous territory. Caring about someone meant risking loss, and he'd already lost enough for one lifetime. But watching Elodie help Marlo flip French toast while explaining the science of caramelization, Thatcher realized he was already in too deep to retreat safely. "Elodie," he said suddenly, surprised by his own voice. Both women turned to look at him. "Would you like to stay for dinner tonight? A real dinner, not just—" He gestured vaguely at the casual meals they'd been sharing. Something shifted in Elodie's expression. Surprise, maybe, or fear. For a moment, he thought she might say no, might retreat behind the professional boundaries they'd been unconsciously dissolving. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice soft. "Very much." Marlo clapped her hands, syrup-sticky fingers leaving prints on everything she touched, and Thatcher felt something dangerous bloom in his chest. Not just attraction, though there was that too, the pull towards someone who had brought light back into his daughter's eyes. This was deeper, more frightening. This felt like hope, and for a man who had spent 2 years building walls around his heart, hope was the most terrifying emotion of all. Because hope meant believing that good things could last, that love didn't always end in loss, that maybe, just maybe, some people stayed, even when staying was the scariest thing they could do. The dinner that was supposed to change everything almost didn't happen at all. Thatcher spent the afternoon in a state of nervous energy he hadn't felt since college, changing his shirt twice, rearranging furniture that didn't need rearranging, and questioning every decision from the wine selection to whether candles were too obvious. When had he become the kind of man who worried about obvious? When had he started wanting something badly enough to be afraid of scaring it away? By 6 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like rosemary and hope. He'd made Marlowe's favorite, herb-crusted chicken with roasted vegetables, but elevated it enough to feel like an occasion. The dining room table, usually buried under architectural plans and unopened mail, was cleared and set for 3 with actual cloth napkins. Marlowe wore her best dress, navy blue with tiny white flowers, and had insisted on brushing her own hair until it shone. She kept running to the window to watch for Elodie, as if their babysitter might change her mind and disappear into the Vermont evening. "She's coming, right, Daddy?" Marlowe asked for the 4th time, her small hands pressed against the glass. "She promised she's coming." "She's coming," Thatcher assured her, though his own certainty wavered. People had made promises before and then found reasons to break them. People left, even when you thought they might stay, especially when you thought they might stay. At 6:15, Elodie knocked on the front door instead of using her key, a small formality that felt significant. Thatcher opened it to find her standing on his doorstep like a nervous teenager, wearing a soft gray dress he'd never seen before, and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that looked like she'd picked them from the meadow behind the cottage. "I wasn't sure about flowers," she said, her usual composure slightly frayed. "They seemed too formal, but showing up empty-handed seemed wrong, and I don't really know the rules for—" She gestured between them, the space that had become something unnamed but undeniable. "They're perfect," Thatcher said, and meant it. Everything about her was perfect. The dress that brought out the green in her eyes, the nervous smile that made her seem younger, the fact that she'd thought about bringing something at all. Dinner started beautifully. Marlowe chattered about everything and nothing, making up elaborate stories about the vegetables on her plate and asking Elodie questions that ranged from profound to absurd. The wine, a bottle he'd been saving for an occasion that never came, tasted like celebration and possibility. But as the evening wore on, Thatcher noticed small changes in Elodie's demeanor. The way her smile became slightly fixed when Marlowe talked about future plans, how she grew quiet when his daughter mentioned the upcoming school year, still months away, the almost imperceptible way she began to retreat, even while sitting at his table. After Marlowe went to bed, with more hugs and more words than she'd given anyone in 2 years, Thatcher and Elodie sat in the living room with coffee that neither of them was drinking. The silence between them had weight now, heavy with things that wanted to be said but didn't know how to find voice. "She's remarkable," Elodie said finally, her gaze focused on the cold fireplace. "Marlowe, she's going to be just fine." There was something final in the way she said it, something that made Thatcher's chest tighten with recognition. He'd heard that tone before, in hospital waiting rooms, in lawyers' offices, in conversations that started with good news and ended with goodbye. Elodie. Her name came out rougher than he intended. "What aren't you telling me?" She looked at him then, and in her eyes he saw the same fear he'd been carrying, the terror of wanting something that felt too good to last. But there was something else there too, something that looked like resignation. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about what's best for Marlowe. Now that she's talking again, now that she's healing, maybe it's time for her to have some distance from the person who helped her find her voice. Sometimes too much dependence on a caregiver can become unhealthy." Thatcher stared at her, trying to process words that felt like they were coming from someone else entirely. "You think leaving would be what's best for her?" "I think," Elodie said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that people like me don't get to stay in places like this. That families like yours deserve someone who can offer more than just temporary healing. People like you," he repeated, anger starting to build in his chest. "What does that mean exactly?" Elodie stood up, pacing to the window where Marlowe had waited for her just hours earlier. "It means someone who failed before, someone who has nightmares about losing children, someone who came here running from guilt and doesn't know how to stop running long enough to build something real." "So you're going to leave," Thatcher said, the words flat with understanding. "Just like that. Just when things start to feel like what?" Elodie turned to face him, tears bright in her eyes. "Like maybe we could be a family. Like maybe damaged people can fix each other, if they just want it badly enough." "That's not how the world works, Thatcher. That's not how I work." Thatcher stood too, closing the distance between them with deliberate steps. Then how do you work, Elodie? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you save broken things and then convince yourself you don't deserve to be saved in return. Maybe because I don't, she whispered. And there it was, the fear that lived beneath all the others. Not just that she might leave, but that she believed she should. That somewhere in her wounded heart, Elodie Quinn had decided that people who failed to save one child didn't deserve the chance to love another. The worst part was, Thatcher understood the logic. He'd spent 2 years believing the same thing about himself. But watching her prepare to walk away from the best thing that had happened to any of them, he realized that understanding broken logic and accepting it were two very different things. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when you think no one is listening. Thatcher found himself back in his security office at 3 in the morning, staring at monitors that had become windows into a life he was about to lose. Elodie had retreated to the guest cottage after their confrontation, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her perfume and the echo of words that felt like a door closing. He wasn't proud of what he was doing. Watching the cameras felt like a violation now, when before it had felt like protection. But he needed to understand. How did someone who had brought his family back to life convince herself she didn't belong in it? The guest cottage cameras showed Elodie moving through the small space like a ghost, gathering belongings with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to pack quickly. Her movements were efficient, but heavy, as if each folded sweater carried weight beyond its fabric. At 3:17 a.m. she sat on the bed with her phone, scrolling through what looked like job listings. Her face was illuminated by the blue glow of the screen, and even through the grainy footage, Thatcher could see the exhaustion etched in her features. This wasn't someone excited about new opportunities. This was someone forcing herself to do what she believed was right, regardless of the cost. Then she made a phone call. Thatcher leaned forward, adjusting the audio levels. The conversation was one-sided, but Elodie's voice carried clearly through the cottage's silence. "Hi, Mrs. Patterson. I know it's late now, but I wanted to let you know I'll be available again next week." A pause. "Yes, the position worked out, but it's time for me to move on. The little girl is doing much better now." Another pause, longer this time. Elodie's free hand pressed against her forehead as if fighting a headache. "No, there wasn't any problem. The family was wonderful. That's part of why I need to leave. Sometimes the best thing you can do for people you care about is not become someone they depend on too much." Thatcher's hands clenched into fists. She was talking about them like they were a case study, a professional situation with clean boundaries and logical conclusions. But the way her voice broke on the word, wonderful, betrayed everything she wasn't saying. "I know I've been doing this for a while," Elodie continued, her voice growing smaller. "I'm moving from family to family, helping with the hard parts and then leaving when things get better. I thought that was enough. I thought that was what I was supposed to do." The person on the other end of the line must have asked a question, because Elodie was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I started wanting to stay," she whispered. "And people like me don't get to want things like that." That phrase again, "people like me," as if she belonged to some category of human being that was excluded from happiness by definition. Thatcher wanted to drive to the cottage immediately, to shake her shoulders and demand she explain who had convinced her she wasn't worthy of love. But then Elodie said something that made him freeze entirely. The father, Thatcher, he's a good man, better than good. And his daughter, Marlo, she's starting to trust again, starting to heal. They deserve someone who can stay forever, not someone who's going to panic the first time things feel too real and find reasons to run. She stood up, walking to the window that faced the main house. The window that, Thatcher realized, was pointed directly at his bedroom. "I think I'm falling in love with them," she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "With both of them, in different ways, and that terrifies me more than anything I've ever felt." The admission hit Thatcher like a physical blow. She loved them, loved him, and that love was exactly what was driving her away. "No, I can't tell him that," Elodie continued, responding to whatever advice she was receiving. "Because if I tell him, he might ask me to stay, and if he asks me to stay, I might say yes. And then what happens when I mess this up the way I messed up with Penny? What happens when my being here becomes the reason something terrible happens to Marlo?" Thatcher closed his eyes, finally understanding the full scope of Elodie's fear. She wasn't just afraid of not being good enough. She was afraid of being too much, of caring so deeply that her love itself became dangerous. It was the same fear that had kept him isolated for 2 years, the same logic that convinced people to build walls instead of bridges. The difference was that he'd been forced to tear his walls down by a 5-year-old who needed him to be brave. Now it was his turn to be brave for someone else. The call ended, and through the monitor, Thatcher watched Elodie sit back down on the bed, her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that looked exactly like the ones he'd witnessed weeks ago, when he'd first realized there was more to her story than she'd shared. But this time, he wasn't watching from a distance, trying to solve the mystery of who she was. This time, he was going to do something about it, because love wasn't something you monitored or managed or protected against. It was something you fought for, even when, especially when, the person you loved was too afraid to fight for it themselves. The knock on the cottage door came at 3:47 a.m., soft but insistent. Elodie sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her packed suitcase at her feet like evidence of a crime she was about to commit. She knew it was Thatcher, had seen his silhouette moving across the yard through her window, purposeful and determined in a way that made her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. She could pretend to be asleep, could wait until morning and slip away before he woke up, leaving only a carefully worded note that explained nothing and everything. It would be easier that way, cleaner. Less chance for either of them to say something that would make leaving impossible. The knock came again, followed by his voice, muffled through the wooden door, but clear enough to stop her breath entirely. "Elodie, I know you're awake. I know you're leaving, and I know why." Her hand flew to her throat, where her pulse hammered against her fingertips. How could he know? She'd been so careful, so professional in her explanations. She hadn't told him about Penny, about the guilt that followed her like a shadow, about the way loving someone felt like holding a loaded gun. "Please," Thatcher continued, and the word cracked something open in her chest. "Just let me say what I came to say. After that, if you still want to leave, I won't stop you." Elodie stood on unsteady legs, her bare feet silent on the cottage's wooden floors. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for what felt like an eternity, caught between the safety of isolation and the terrifying possibility of hope. When she opened the door, Thatcher stood in the pool of light from the porch lamp, still wearing the clothes from dinner but looking like he'd been awake for hours. His dark hair was disheveled, his gray-green eyes bright with something that looked like desperation tempered by determination. "You heard my phone call," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. The realization should have made her angry. It was a violation of privacy, a breach of trust. Instead, it felt like relief. Finally, someone knew the full truth about who she was and what she was capable of destroying. "I heard you say you were falling in love with us," Thatcher said, stepping closer but not yet crossing the threshold. "I heard you say you were afraid that loving us would somehow hurt us. And I heard you convince yourself that the best thing you could do for people you care about is disappear." Elodie wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold together pieces that felt like they were flying apart. "You don't understand. I understand perfectly." His voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone who had spent years having the same argument with himself. "I understand because I've been telling myself the same lies for 2 years. That loving someone means risking their safety. That caring too much is what causes the disasters. That the best way to protect the people you love is to keep them at arm's length." Tears burned behind her eyes, hot and unwelcome. "Thatcher, you don't know what I did. You don't know. I know you blame yourself for a little girl's death," he said quietly. "I know you were 16 and trying to do your best in an impossible situation. I know you've spent the last 11 years punishing yourself for a split second when life went wrong and you couldn't fix it." The words hit her like physical blows, each one finding its target with devastating accuracy. How did he know about her age? About the specific weight of guilt she'd been carrying? How could he see so clearly into the dark corners of her heart? "I also know," Thatcher continued, his voice growing stronger, "that you saved my daughter's life. Not from physical danger, but from something worse. From a world where she believed her voice didn't matter, where silence was safer than connection, where love was something that only brought pain." "That's different," Elodie whispered, but even as she said it, she could hear how hollow the words sounded. "Is it?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to do to Marlo exactly what you're afraid of. Leave her when she needs you most. Teach her that people who love you eventually go away. Show her that her happiness isn't worth fighting for." The accusation landed like a slap, sharp and clarifying. Elodie's hand gripped the doorframe as the full implications of his words sank in. By trying to protect Marlo from potential future hurt, she was guaranteeing present hurt. By trying to prevent herself from becoming essential, she was proving that connections couldn't be trusted. But you have a choice, Thatcher said. And now he did step forward, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes. Close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something that might have been fear. You can keep running from love because it's scary, or you can stay and find out what happens when two broken people decide to be brave enough to heal together. What if I hurt her? Elodie's voice came out small and raw. What if I hurt you? What if everything I touch turns to ash because that's what people like me do? Thatcher reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement like he was approaching a wounded animal, when his fingers touched her face, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. His touch was so gentle it made her want to collapse. What if you don't? He said simply. What if love is the thing that saves us all? And standing there in the doorway between her old life and a new one, between fear and faith, between running and staying, Elodie Quinn realized that the most terrifying question in the world wasn't what would happen if she stayed. It was what would happen if she didn't. The answer came not from Elodie, but from a small voice behind Thatcher that cut through the dawn air like a bell. Please don't go. They both turned to see Marlo standing in the main house's doorway, her blonde hair messy from sleep, wearing pink pajamas and the most serious expression a 5-year-old could manage. She held her favorite stuffed rabbit, a threadbare thing she hadn't touched since the accident, clutched against her chest like armor. Marlo, sweetheart, Thatcher started, but his daughter was already walking toward them with the determined stride of someone who had finally found words for feelings too big to contain. I heard you talking, Marlo said, her clear blue eyes moving between the two adults who had become her world. I heard you say you might leave because you think you're not good enough for us. Elodie dropped to her knees on the cottage's front step, bringing herself to Marlo's eye level. Baby, you don't understand. I do understand, Marlo interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to track down her cheeks. I understand because I thought the same thing. I thought if I didn't talk, if I didn't say anything bad, then maybe no one else would go away. But you taught me that staying quiet doesn't keep people safe, it just keeps them lonely. The words, Elodie's own wisdom reflected back by the child she'd helped heal, hung in the air like a challenge to everything she believed about herself. Elodie, Marlo continued, reaching out to touch the woman's face with small, gentle fingers. You're not the reason bad things happen. You're the reason good things can happen again. Thatcher watched his daughter, this brave, wise little girl who had found her voice just in time to use it for the most important conversation of all their lives, and felt something break open in his chest. Love, fear, gratitude, and hope all tangled together until he couldn't tell where one emotion ended and another began. She's right, he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. Marlo's right about everything. You're not the storm, Elodie. You're the calm after it. You're the reason this house feels like home again instead of just a place where we sleep. Elodie looked between them, father and daughter united in their certainty that she belonged with them, and for the first time in 11 years, allowed herself to consider the possibility that they might be right, that maybe love wasn't a weapon that wounded everything it touched, but a force that could heal what seemed permanently broken. I'm scared, she whispered, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. We're all scared, Thatcher said, moving closer until the three of them formed a small circle on the cottage steps. I'm scared of losing someone I love again. Marlo's scared of saying the wrong thing and making people disappear. You're scared of not being enough, but maybe being scared together is better than being safe apart. Marlo nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by stepping forward and wrapping her arms around Elodie's waist. I love you, she said simply, as if announcing the weather. And love means staying. You taught me that. Elodie's composure finally crumbled completely. She gathered Marlo into her arms, burying her face in the little girl's hair, and let herself cry, not the desperate, guilty tears she'd shed in darkness, but the messy, healing tears of someone who was finally allowing herself to be loved. I love you too, she whispered against Marlo's ear. Both of you. So much it terrifies me. Thatcher knelt beside them, his arms encircling both his daughter and the woman who had become essential to their survival. For a moment, they stayed like that, three people who had been broken in different ways, holding each other together on the front steps of a cottage where everything had changed. So you'll stay? Marlo asked, pulling back to look at Elodie with eyes that held all the hope in the world. Elodie looked at Thatcher, seeing in his face the same question, the same desperate hope that maybe this time, love would be stronger than fear, that maybe this time, the good thing would last. "I'll stay," she said, and the words felt like a promise and a prayer and a leap of faith all at once. "If you'll have me, I'll stay." Marlowe's whoop of joy shattered the pre-dawn quiet, and Thatcher's smile was brighter than the sunrise beginning to paint the Vermont sky. As they sat on the cottage steps, a family that had found each other in the wreckage of their separate griefs, Elodie realized that sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't to protect people from your love. Sometimes the bravest thing was to trust them with it. And for the first time in 11 years, Elodie Quinn stopped running long enough to discover what happened when you stayed. What happened was everything. 18 months later, the laughter echoing through the Vermont house was different now. Fuller, richer, layered with the kind of joy that only comes from time and trust, and the daily choice to stay. Elodie stood at the kitchen window, watching Thatcher and Marlowe build what they insisted was an architecturally sound snowman in the backyard. Their daughter, because that's what Marlowe had become, officially and completely, was 7 now, all elbows and opinions, and an endless stream of chatter that made the house feel vibrantly alive. "The head is structurally unsound, Daddy," Marlowe called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been learning construction principles from bedtime stories. "We need better foundation support." Thatcher laughed, a sound that had become as natural as breathing, and adjusted the snowman's base with exaggerated precision. "You're absolutely right, Chief Architect. What would I do without my consulting engineer?" Elodie smiled, absently touching the simple gold band on her left ring finger. 6 months married, and she still sometimes caught herself marveling at the weight of it. Not heavy like a burden, but substantial like an anchor. A reminder that she had chosen to stay, and they had chosen to keep her. The kitchen around her bore evidence of their life together. Marlowe's artwork covering the refrigerator, Thatcher's coffee mug, the one that read, "World's Most Adequate Dad," a Father's Day gift that had made him laugh until he cried, and her own touches everywhere. Herbs growing on the windowsill, books of poetry stacked on the counter, the kind of beautiful mess that happens when people actually live in their space instead of just existing in it. From upstairs came the soft sound of the guest room being converted into something new, a nursery, pale yellow and full of possibility. The baby wasn't due for another 4 months, but Thatcher had insisted on starting early, claiming that proper planning was essential for optimal infant architecture. Really, Elodie suspected he was just excited, though he tried to hide it behind practical concerns about crib placement and optimal light exposure. "Mama," Marlowe's voice called from outside, and Elodie's heart still did a little skip at the name. It had taken months for Marlowe to work up the courage to use it, and longer still for Elodie to believe she deserved it, but now it felt as natural as sunrise, as essential as air. She opened the kitchen door, winter cold nipping at her cheeks. "What's the verdict on the snowman?" "He's perfect," Marlowe announced, "but he needs a face. Will you help us find the right stones?" Elodie pulled on her coat, Thatcher's old one, really, but it had become hers through the mysterious alchemy of marriage, and walked out into the backyard where her family waited. The yard was different too, marked by the evidence of seasons spent together, the vegetable garden they'd planted in spring, the tire swing Thatcher had hung from the old oak tree, the spot where they'd had Marlowe's 7th birthday party with half her 2nd grade class and enough cake to feed Vermont. As they searched for the perfect snowman features, Elodie found herself thinking about the woman who had almost left 18 months ago. That woman had been so afraid of taking up too much space, of wanting too much, of loving so deeply it might destroy what it touched. She'd believed that people like her, people who had failed before, didn't deserve second chances at happiness. But here she was, belly gently rounded with new life, watching her husband and daughter debate the aerodynamic properties of carrot noses, and she realized that the woman who had been afraid to stay would barely recognize the woman who had learned to call this place home. "Perfect," Marlowe declared, placing the final stone that served as the snowman's mouth. "He looks happy." "He should," Thatcher said, wrapping his arms around both of them from behind. "He lives here." As evening painted the snow purple and gold, they stood together in their backyard, Thatcher solid and warm against Elodie's back, Marlowe chattering about plans for tomorrow, the baby stirring gently under Elodie's heart. The house behind them glowed with lamplight and the promise of dinner, homework, bedtime stories, and all the beautiful ordinary moments that made up a life. Elodie closed her eyes and listened to the language of home, Marlowe's bright voice planning elaborate snow fort blueprints, Thatcher's quiet laughter, the whisper of wind through bare branches, the distant sound of neighbors calling their children inside. This was what staying looked like. Not the dramatic gesture of a single moment, but the daily choice to trust that love could be stronger than fear, that broken things could heal without losing their essential shape, that sometimes the best thing you could do for people you loved was simply to let them love you back. When they finally went inside, tracking snow and happiness through the mudroom, Elodie paused at the kitchen threshold. Through the window, she could see the guest cottage where she had once packed her bags and prepared to disappear. Now it served as Thatcher's expanded home office, the place where he designed houses for other people, while she and Marlowe debated dinner options and the baby practiced tiny kicks against her ribs. She had stopped running long enough to discover what happened when you stayed. What happened was everything she had ever been afraid to hope for. What happened was home. The end. What would you have done in Elodie's position? Would you have had the courage to stay when staying felt more dangerous than leaving? Sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving most. What do you think about the idea that love isn't something we earn, but something we choose to accept? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.